What was your family home like?
My father was an only child, and during the Depression, my grandfather was laid off, like so many people were. My daddy had to support not only his own family, but his parents. They had lost their home. This is home they had built, just like they wanted, and they had to move out of that and move into my grandparents' big home because there wasn't room in their home for everybody. So it really wasn't an ideal situation because my mother and grandmother simply didn't get along well. I think it affected me a lot, really. I was a nervous kind of little girl, and my parents were absolutely devoted. It was I'd say for Spring Hill it was an average neighborhood. There were no fancy houses. There were children in the neighborhood, and we played with each other a lot. And I think that it was a good place to grow up in.
That's great.
Mary B. Austin is a school that has been there from the time I was a young child. It's a grammar school. At that time it was just Spring Hill School. It is now Mary B. Austin School because she was the first principal, and she taught me in the 7th grade.
Did you walk to school every day?
I didn't need to. I jumped over the fence. My daddy worked for the bank. My mother never worked until during the war, the Second World War. Daddy had been one of 2 graduates in his class graduating from high school. Hardly anybody ever went to college in those days. But Daddy had graduated, and therefore he was given a job at the bank. And he worked at Merchants National Bank all of his life. They certainly did. They admired President Roosevelt very much. I know my daddy was particularly grateful that he took action and was unafraid to do things that a lot of people would have thought were rash. But for instance, Daddy worked at the bank, and he knew that any time the bank could close. My mama and Daddy were very kind to the people that I knew that were poor. It was the black people that were poor. And we had, our servant came every day except Sunday. And I remember going to the part of Spring Hill where the black people lived. It was called Sandtown, and it was right in the area, especially as you go down the hill from St. Ignatius Church. That's where Sandtown was. Of course, the church wasn't there. The only Catholic church at the time was St. Joseph's Chapel at Spring Hill College. They just lived in very small little houses. And I remember going there once with my mother, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if it wasn't to help out a woman that worked for us. Sarah was a lovely lady, a quiet, tall lady that would be around the house sweeping and cooking and everything, doing everything to a large extent to help. I know that my daddy gave money and went to see a crippled man. It's very good too. We played lots of games, but they were usually outdoor games. We would hold hands and sing, "Here we go loopity-loo, here we go loopity-loo." Mainly it was just free-for-all, running around, hiding and playing. I do remember we used to do gymnastics, and we girls had to very carefully tuck our skirts into our bloomers, do handstands and cartwheels and things like that on the lawn. Being outdoors was just great when you lived out in, pretty much out in the country. Yeah, you feel a lot of freedom to play. Certainly an enriching young life. I was very lucky to have the parents that I had. There was this very special tree that we would go and climb. And the whole neighborhood, children of different ages, you could find there. And it was a big, very old oak with limbs that stretched out way over the schoolyard. Miss Austin came to the house and had lunch with us one time, my family. And of course that was a day I remember because that was the principal of my school. A very good teacher and somebody that knew how to take hold of the situation. There were some boys that came from a little further on than Spring Hill. Now it's all built up with the university and everything, but then it was just dense woods. And there were a couple of boys that came from that area that were hard to manage. And I never will forget Miss Austin taking one of those boys to the cloakroom and whipping them with a belt. She had a belt. And I never forget hearing him holler. But in those days, that not only was permissible, it was wise, I think, because we children really respected the teacher and would not cut out. Or if we did, we'd know that our hands would get slapped with a ruler. You learn to behave as soon as you went to school, if you hadn't already learned. You already learned in my family. From the time you were little, you knew that you must obey. I have a couple of grandchildren that go to Mary B. Austin School, and old Ann is still there in the schoolyard. Not that often. Of course, when I got older in my teens, yes, I'm sure I did go to town more often. Had to go to town to find a job. My mama had two younger sisters that were teens, and they took us to the movie in Mobile. Not that often, but often enough that we didn't miss the best movies. And there were, in those days, there were a lot of musicals. Mm-hmm. And we loved the movies, usually to the Sanger. And the Sanger Theater is still there in Mobile. Mm-hmm. But there also were other theaters on Dolphin Street. The Crown. We didn't go that often. I think it made it more of a thrill when we did go.
What did you enjoy doing with your family?
We would be all of us in the living room. There'd be a fire in the fireplace. Programs where somebody with a very good voice would have their own program, and they'd sing popular songs. Comedies that would be favorites of ours. That was fun to be with the family and listen to the radio.
Did you ever go on summer vacations with your family? What was it like?
Oh yes, we sure did. It was usually always to Fairhope or to Point Clare. Although we didn't stay long. There were some people that had homes, summer homes over there, as well as their home in Mobile. But we weren't that rich. We didn't have a home over there until later. Now when I grew up, at the end of the Depression, my daddy and mama did buy a place over there. Daddy worked at the bank in the real estate department, and he, at a time when he didn't have a car, because the car that we had broken down during the Depression, and then when the war came along, then they weren't making any cars. It had belonged to my grandmother's friend, my maternal grandmother. She had rented that little house from her friend, and I remember going over there and playing under the house in the sand. Of course, my mom and daddy remembered that place, so that when daddy bought that property, they were anxious to go over there and see it, but they didn't have any car. So daddy was hoping maybe the house was still there, but it was an old house when I was a little girl, so he didn't know whether the house would be there, and got off of the bus and walked down the hill, and the house was there, and that was really a thrill for them. And of course it was in bad condition. They had to do a lot of work. They started taking shovels and brooms and different things on the bus over there when they could have time off and worked on that house. And that house was a real joy to us as I was growing up.
Did you ever save up your own money to buy things?
I did when I got a job and got interested in your grandfather. Of course, he wasn't there a lot of the time when I was working downtown, because he was in the Army, and the Army turned to the Air Force, and he was in the Air Force for 9 years. When he was courting me, I was working downtown in Mobile for lawyers. And yes, I did save my money, and I bought myself a sewing machine because I like to sew, and I bought, when I knew we'd set the date for getting married and we wanted a family, I bought a set of towels.
Did you ever go out with your family to get ice cream and such?
Yes, that was a happy memory. That was one of the things that made Sundays special. But we would go on Sunday afternoon rides, and on the way home we'd always get an ice cream cone. So that was such a treat. We didn't go to the grocery store and buy a big box of ice cream like we do now. In fact, we made our own ice cream sometimes. Usually for dessert on Sundays we had either a vanilla pudding, or sometimes what Mama used to call cottage pudding. It was a 1-egg flat cake, and you put chocolate sauce over it. But on rare occasions, Mama made ice cream. You had to have a special bucket ice cream maker.
How did getting food work back then? Did you get all your food at the grocery store? Or?
No. In those days, I remember my grandmother's kitchen, and I remember Mama getting out the flour barrel. It would sit on the kitchen table, and she'd pull it out and dip into the flour barrel to get her flour. You'd buy a whole sack of flour when you'd go to get supplies. Vegetable man would come 2 or 3 times a week and either call out or honk his horn, and he'd come into the yard close to the house, and then Mama would go down and choose the vegetables she wanted and pay him for the vegetables. And then there were other deliveries like milk. The milkman would come and leave the glass bottles of milk on the steps, empty after we used the milk. We'd wash out the bottles and put the empty bottles back out there for him to pick up. Now the milk was interesting. In those days, your whole milk was in a bottle, and the cream would have risen to the top so that the whole neck of the bottle would be solid cream. You'd have to spoon it out.
When you got a job?
I think it affected me in good ways. It was just a good part of growing up, was to have really become skilled at typewriter and shorthand and be able to hold a job and make money.
So where did you work?
In lawyer's office, downtown in the Van Antwerp building. The Van Antwerp building was our tallest building in Mobile. It was 12 stories, and that was a high building in Mobile. Until the Mercantile Bank, that was our skyscraper. Now it looks tiny compared to other buildings. In fact, I worked for Winston Groom, the father of the Winston Groom, wrote Forrest Gump. Oh, we don't have a barrel of money. Maybe we're ragged and funny, but we'll travel along, singing a song, side by side. Don't know what's... Never mind, we're not going to have any more.
Okay.
I don't think that our practice is enough.